All right. Hello, everybody. This is Keith from Last Call Bar Academy, and I'm going to chat with everyone today about the principle of charity, which is a concept that I'm really excited about. And I'm really the only person who's talking about this in terms of applying it to the LSAT because I just sort of discovered the application myself not too long ago. So, the principle of charity, if you want to look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see that I got this definition straight from Wikipedia. In philosophy and rhetoric, it's a principle that requires, in the case of any argument, that the interpreter consider the best or strongest possible interpretation of that argument. So why does that matter? I think it matters because all of the materials on the market, the ones I was just criticizing, as a matter of fact, their angle on logical reasoning is that you should read the argument and then categorize the flaw. They tell you this list of fallacies and you just match it up. Which one does it, which mistake does it make? But I think that what is wrong about that strategy is that it's instantly critical of the argument and it doesn't follow the principle of charity, which means that you have to interpret the argument the strongest way possible, not start attacking it immediately. There's certain points of the argument that may be valid and are not proper bases for attack. And so you have to understand which parts of the argument are strong and which parts of the argument are weak. That will help you when you get to the answer choices because you won't be so tempted by some of the traps that are really hinting at parts of the argument that aren't weak and don't correspond to flaws. All right. So last time we were chatting, I was talking about flaw family questions and argument family questions, and what I suggested was that once you find the conclusion of the argument, you should have a step in your process for reconstructing or constructing the argument before you start looking for the gaps. The analogy that I've used in the past for that is that if you think of the argument like a puzzle that's disassembled in the box, and the argument is flawed, it's missing a piece of the puzzle. And so what the other sources are telling you to do is to take that puzzle all in pieces in the box, the way that the LR stimulus presents it to you, and just find the missing piece, brute force it. Look at every single answer choice and compare it to the argument and see if that's the missing piece. And what I've argued for a long time is that that's silly. It makes a lot more sense to me to just put the puzzle together, and then it's obvious what piece of the puzzle is missing. We don't have to argue about it or debate the answer choices. There is one piece missing and one answer choice that corresponds to that missing piece. So for me, starting to employ the principle of charity, it not only helps me on the hardest questions, which I talked to you guys about yesterday, the ones that have two correct answers or no good answers. Not only does the principle of charity help me on those, but it helps me even on the straightforward questions because it helps me to construct the best version of the argument very quickly. And then I can really hone in on the gaps without going back and rethinking the logic over and over again. All right, so here's what I mean by constructing the argument. Most of the other resources, to their credit, are going to tell you on LR, you should find the conclusion of each argument. I don't know how many of the resources are suggesting that you annotate it religiously. Don't ever read a conclusion without underlining it. And my reason for that is that the underline, the visual cue, it serves as a visual anchor that draws your attention back to the conclusion every time you start to forget the scope. So when I get confused by answer choice D, I have this one thing underlined and it draws my eyes back. And I think, okay, now that I'm debating B and D and I've eliminated all of the junk, I have to remind myself of some of those details that are easy to forget. And the crux, the point of the spear is the conclusion of the argument. So I don't want to have to go back and refigure it out. I want it to be underlined. In other words, what I'm doing is anticipating that I will forget. The question on the LSAT should never be, I won't forget this. It should be, what am I going to do when I forget this? When I forget the conclusion, what I'm going to do is read it again because it's underlined. All right. When you're finding conclusions, most of the other resources are going to tell you to look for these indicator words for the conclusions, therefore, thus, consequently, hence, so, should. And I have students frequently ask me if they should memorize these lists, etc. My answer is usually no. You should look these words up in the dictionary and know precisely what they mean. And then you can understand which ones are synonyms for another without memorizing the list itself. But at any rate, I find the premise indicators to actually be more reliable than the conclusion indicators for two reasons. Number one, because there isn't always a conclusion indicator, whereas it's hard to construct an argument without premise indicators. And number two, sometimes there are subsidiary conclusions, and so the conclusion indicators are misleading, and the premise indicators can help me reverse out of that trap. But ultimately, and here's what I want to try to teach you guys today, the principle of charity tells us that the conclusion of the argument is going to be the statement that is most supported by the other statements. That's reading with charity, reading it so that you're constructing the argument in the strongest way possible. So the conclusion is always going to be supported by one or more other statements. And also, the conclusion will not support any other statement, because if it does, then it's not at the top of the hierarchy. It's a subsidiary conclusion. So I don't find that the other resources really talk about that all too much. They talk about the indicators a lot because that's easier. But in actuality, what makes something the conclusion has more to do with the underlying logic. And I'll show you how we can debate that even with just a very simple argument. Once I've found and underlined the conclusion, I paraphrase it. What I mean by that is I simplify it if it was overly technical or complex. But also, one of the reasons why I find paraphrasing to be crucial is that I incorporate referenced ideas. For example, this argument is wrong is a meaningless paraphrase of the conclusion unless you mentally incorporate whatever this stands for, whatever position is wrong. And then I find it helpful to take one more step and say, well, negations are abstractions. So rather than thinking about the wrong idea, can I negate it and think about what is the right way to think about that problem? What's the right idea? So I go through a pretty lengthy process of paraphrasing the conclusion before I even start to parse the strengths of the logic. And I'll tell you what, at this point, when I'm working with a student, they're way ahead of me. They're on answer choice A already. I haven't even figured out how to organize the ideas, but I'm going to beat them. I'm going to beat them to the end, because once I get the structure in place, the answer choices will be cake, and they're still going to be confused by answer choices B and C and D, where they're brute forcing these very complex statements. So once I find the conclusion, I'm not done with it. I separate it into the subject and predicate, and this involves knowledge of English syntax. This is, why the other materials don't talk about it. It's hard. How do you learn English grammar? How do you learn English syntax? You have to be willing to kind of probe some things that you take for granted in your own speech and your own writing, and get more particular about what they mean. But the reason I think this is so important, to organize the conclusion or separate the conclusion into a subject and predicate, is that it gives you an immediate framework for organizing the premises. Any premise that relates to the subject of the conclusion, we designate as a minor premise under the Greek syllogism system. And any premise that relates to the predicate of the conclusion is designated as a major premise. And there's a specific model, a specific form for how the minor premise has to interact with the major premise in order to create a valid argument that completely supports the conclusion. I'll show you the model on one of the next slides, if I can get to it. All right, so I want to show you guys a really simple example. I've got three statements here, but I've stripped away all of the indicators. There's no indicator stating which of these are premises and which is the conclusion. The three statements are: all humans are mortal, Socrates is mortal, Socrates is human. What's the conclusion of the argument? Does anyone want to jump in?
Socrates is mortal.
Yeah, Socrates is mortal, right? And this is a famous syllogism, so it's likely that you guys have heard this before. And also, it's so intuitive. That's why I like to use it, because it's pretty clear
I did want to
that
say
if
at first, but I'm like, that's not right.
what's that? It's intuitive.
No, I just because it was the last thing there. I'm like, oh, that's the conclusion, but I know it's not right.
Which one? Socrates is human?
Yeah, that's
I
what my
mean,
brain went to first, and I'm like, no, it's not even close.
yeah, that's exactly why I put it in this order, because I wanted to show you that the order of the sentences is not part of the underlying logic. According to the principle of charity, it's not, because if we always assume that the last sentence is the conclusion, we're not giving the argument its due weight. There may be a stronger way to interpret the argument. Let me give you an example. So I set up these three T diagrams, and this is a structural diagram that Jacob Feldman and I have invented to organize the ideas when you're dealing with an argument, namely how to organize a minor premise and a major premise, and to check the conceptual overlap of all the concepts. So what I've done here is I've laid out three different versions of this argument using each of the three different sentences as the conclusion. So in the first, which Kurt tells us is the correct version, the conclusion is Socrates is immortal. Right? And let's suppose, I'm not sure if that's the conclusion. So I'm going to test the strength of the argument by saying, all right, if the subject of that conclusion is Socrates, well, what other statement do I have that could serve as the minor premise? In other words, what other statement is about Socrates? That statement is Socrates is a human. Now I move over to the predicate of the conclusion. Well, which of my premises talks about a mortal? The major premise, all humans are mortals. And so we have a conceptual overlap there. So that's how I would organize the concepts. I'll come back to why the logic is sound or unsound for these arguments. I just want to map them out briefly on this slide. So the second version of the argument says, what if we suppose, as Kurt said, that the last sentence is the conclusion? Socrates is a human. We would analyze the argument the same way. We would say, all right, well, the subject is Socrates. Which of the other statements could then serve as the minor premise? Socrates is immortal. Now I shift over. What about the predicate of the conclusion? Is a human. I need a rule to serve as the major premise, and I have the other sentence, all humans are mortal. And so we have conceptual overlap with those ideas. There's how we would organize the second version of the argument. The third version would put the first sentence as the conclusion. All humans are mortals. All right, now I need to know, well, which of the premises is about humans? Socrates is a human. That's the premise about humans. So we would put that, organize it as the minor premise of the argument. Which premise is about mortals? Socrates is a mortal. That would be the conceptual overlap with the predicate of the argument. All right, now how do you test the validity of the argument? I call this circuit logic, because in a valid argument, you should be able to make a complete circle. The conclusion purports to connect two ideas, Socrates and a mortal. And so in order to do that, what we need is a series of steps. We need to go from the subject of the conclusion through the minor premise to what's called a middle term. That's the blue term, a human. And then in a sound argument, the major premise will repeat the middle term and connect it back to the predicate of the argument. So we intuitively know, I think, that Kurt was right, that Socrates is immortal has to be true if Socrates is a human and all humans are mortals. That is a syllogism. It's undeniable that the conclusion is true if the premises are true. But the way that we check the validity of that logic is a little more formal. We can do it by observing or double checking the conceptual overlap between the minor premise and the subject, the major premise and the predicate. And then the final check, I should say final two checks, is do we have a middle term that overlaps? Here we do. It's human, the blue term. And is the minor premise and the major premise strong enough to support the full strength of the predicate? Socrates is a mortal definitively. And the only way we could know that definitively is if all of that middle term were mortals. So that is a valid argument, and it follows from the upper left box Follow the arrows around and you see that it completely justifies the predicate of the argument. But look at the problem we get into when we try to justify the argument in the other forms. If I wanted to prove that Socrates is a human, I have to start with the minor premise that Socrates is a mortal. So far, so good. Mortal is probably going to be my middle term then. But then when we get to the major premise, we have a problem because it's all humans are mortals. Notice that the sentence, if we think of it as a conditional statement, it's pointing the wrong way. It's starting from the predicate and connecting it back to the minor premise instead of following the direction of the arrows as I've laid them out here. So what I did is I said, okay, well, the principle of charity says that we have to interpret this argument in the strongest form possible, which means that I have to consider all of the paraphrases and all of the deductive implications of that sentence, not just the grammar, all humans are mortals. So I rephrased the sentence and I said, could we support the conclusion if we took the deduction of the paraphrase that some mortals are humans, which we would know if all humans are mortals, then some mortals have to be humans. But we still don't get there because here's the logic. Socrates is a mortal. Some mortals are humans. Therefore, Socrates is a human? Maybe. Potentially he is, but it's also possible that he is one of the mortals that is not human. If only some of them are definitely human, then there's a possibility that some are not. And Socrates might be one of those mortals who is not. So we don't prove the conclusion in that sense. So if we have to choose between version 1 or version 2, even with no indicators whatsoever, the principle of charity tells us that the correct conclusion is version 1. And I'll show you quickly how version 3 doesn't work either. If we try to put all humans are mortals as the conclusion, then the minor premise would be Socrates is a human. And again, we have the syntax of the sentence backward, but that's no problem. We can paraphrase sentences in English. So I can flip it so that the subject of the sentence is about humans and the predicate of the sentence is about Socrates. But the problem is that the original predicate was a human, not all humans. So even when I flip the sentence around, I get some human is Socrates, and that's only a subset of all humans. So we're starting on a bad foot here in terms of conceptual overlap with the minor premise and the subject, but let's just roll with it. If we move over to the major premise, we have Socrates is a mortal, and so the rule overlaps well with the predicate of the conclusion. The weakness of this argument truly is the strength of the conclusion versus the strength of the minor premise. You can't reach a conclusion about all humans when your premise only justifies a middle term applicable to some human. So that's also a fallacy. That's an invalid argument. And with no indicators whatsoever, we would still know the conclusion of that 3-sentence argument. So I wanted to chat with you guys about that because, and I'm glad that I'm glad that we did, because that really plays into one of the fundamentals that I think is not being taught well in any of the materials really. And I didn't make this stuff up. I sometimes I feel like I'm peddling a gimmick here, and like students are like, come on, I don't want to learn another system. This is crazy. This isn't a system. This is what the ancient Greek philosophers came up with. And philosophers for hundreds of years ever since have nodded their heads and said, yes, this works. This is how you deductively prove whether statements are true or false, given a rhetorical structure, an argumentative structure. So I wish that the market was not as fickle as it is. And I wish that they were teaching skills and not test tricks and gimmicks. But unfortunately, I believe that much of what exists is test tricks and gimmicks. And therefore, I wanted to give you guys a little flavor of what the underlying logic actually looks like when you're trying to unpack an argument. And they get much more complicated than that, of course. How could we complicate it? We add a series of steps. Instead of 2 premises, we have 3 or 4 or 5. We could have subsidiary conclusions where there's arguments within arguments. When you have multiple premises, sometimes they work as sequential arguments, or sometimes they work sort of en masse with a rule that kind of summarizes all of the minor premises together. So there's a whole lot of different variations on this theme, but your ability to construct the argument or organize the argument ultimately is what gives me the ability to make very accurate predictions about the right answers. It blows my students' minds because they go right to the answer choices, and I'm always shaking my head saying, "You're making a mistake." And they're like, "No, no, I can figure this out." And I'll hold back and tell them, "You go ahead, you figure that out." And I'll hold back and I'll do what I'm talking about while they read answer choice A, while they read answer choice B. They're way ahead of me in their mind because I haven't even looked at the answer choices yet. And 10 or 15 seconds later, I'll say, "It's C. I'm done." And they're still completely flummoxed. They're still thinking, "Well, I left A in. I still have to evaluate D. I wasn't sure about C because it's confusing." Understanding the underlying logic tells you what to look for in the answer choices. And then you don't have to brute force them as heavily. Some of them just don't say what it has to say to be correct. And that's apparent without a full interpretation of the answer. All right, so I'm going to stop the slideshow